And we're going to explore the life and legacy of Curt Flood, who helped pave the way for baseball's free agency system, and how he continues his family to push his candidacy for the Hall of Fame. All that and much more with my buddy Steve Hartman on the Ford Sports Final.
Now, KTLA5 Sports Final.
Still ahead of this show, we hear from the family of Curt Flood and how his struggles impacted them, and why they feel he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame after he changed the future of baseball.
Flood is up, with Maxville still on third. Ron Borg pitches, Curt lines a single to center, and Maxville scores the game's first run.
All right, in focus today as Curt Flood held his public battle with Major League Baseball over the reserve clause over 50 years ago. His 5 children, Debbie, Gary, now deceased, Shelley, Curt Jr., and Scott dealt with it from afar. For the first time in one setting, 3 of his children sat down to discuss their experience with our very own Rashawn Haylock.
As Curt Flood underwent his predestined battle in the U.S. Supreme Court, the whole country took notice. Flood's 5 children lived it.
It was hard. And it still is to this day, to be very honest.
He was largely not only a media darling and a company guy, really. Even Bob Gibson said, did I think that Curt Flood would be the guy that, prior to his doing it? Absolutely not. He simply was not that kind of guy.
Flood refused to report to Philadelphia after the Cardinals traded him there in 1969 and demanded Commissioner Buie Kuhn declare him a free agent. His stand disrupted the baseball world and staggered those closest to him. Son Gary took it especially hard.
His wall was covered in baseball cards, and he snatched every one of them down. He went into a rage about it.
All we knew was that if we didn't see him before, with regularity, we were not going to see him even more, after this had occurred.
As Flood fought Major League Baseball over the right to be a free agent, he was also the target of death threats and suffered from depression, loneliness, and alcoholism. Eventually, he fled to Spain, while his children remained in Los Angeles with their mother and stepfather.
I think his walking in and telling us that he was leaving, that he was done, and for my stepfather to take care of us, not understanding the stress he was under, his mental health.
I was a big crybaby, I was a very emotional kid. And the particular night that he said the things that Debbie was speaking of, I felt tired.
Our mom kept us really busy. Back then, there were diversions that were always there to participate in. When all of that failed, you run down to Ike and Tina Turner's house.
How did I cope? I had good friends that understood. I had siblings that were going through it, that supported me, protected me.
Flood's self-imposed exile proved not to be the panacea he'd hoped. After 6 years, beaten and broken, he returned to the States and made it a mission to at least try and reestablish a relationship with his children.
When he came back, I missed the smell of him, hugging him and the bristliness of his face. I missed everything about him. I guess I cut him some slack because I was just so delighted to have him back, and back in one piece. And he really was a good dude.
I think we were all excited, Rashawn. It was something that we had all been waiting for.
But their father was still suffering, and finding his way back was a long battle.
5 years or so after he stopped drinking and, went cold turkey, his brain began to heal. With that, mental health and emotional health and spiritual health came better relationships and relationships with us.
Even so, some wounds are simply too immeasurable to ever get past.
The pain was really deep for him. From the time he started playing, to the segregation, to the name calling, to how people felt and talked about him, to the things he had done in his life that he remembered, he didn't feel good about. One being us, his children.
Flood's legacy can be traced to the now common practice of baseball free agency. though the fact that it cost him his career and mental stability still seems a high price for one man. His children continue to fight for what they feel is their dad's rightful place in the Hall of Fame.
If Cooperstown is the venue that houses the history of the game of baseball, it is incomplete without putting our father in its installation and its story to provide the true, accurate history of the game.
Flood's only path to Cooperstown lies in the Golden Days Committee, which votes every 5 years.
The climate and the environment that is a part of Cooperstown still has a ways of maturity to go before it can appreciate who my dad was and what his contribution to Major League Baseball, and not only Major League Baseball, but sports altogether. If it's not this year, it'll be in 5 years. And if it's not in 5 years, it'll be in another 5 years. But it will happen.
And the next vote for the Golden Days Committee is scheduled for December for inclusion into baseball's Hall of Fame class of 2022. Given Flood's impact in changing baseball by helping bring an end to the reserve clause, obviously so much passion there with his family. Should he be in the Hall of Fame?
You would almost have to create his own category. As a player, by the way, Curt Flood was an outstanding player. He won, I believe, 7 Gold Gloves. He's part of 2 World Championship teams in the Cardinals. And he was an outstanding hitter for that era. It was a very pitching-dominated decade of the 60s. There are lesser players in the Hall of Fame, but amongst his contemporaries, he might be a notch below. But I like what his daughter had to say about if the Hall of Fame is there to tell the story of the game. You cannot tell the story of Major League Baseball and free agency, which changed the entire dynamic of baseball, without Curt Flood. Marvin Miller, who was the first head of the Players Union, who I interviewed, had not been elected to the Hall of Fame until he passed away. Curt obviously has been gone for many, many years. So it's almost like, to really tell his story, you almost have to create his own category. I don't know how you do that. He's never even been nominated in this category that they're talking about. They'll pick 10 finalists and then vote on him. He's never been on that list. So there's a long way to go as far as they're concerned. And there are people on that committee that don't exactly feel like he did what was best for the game.
But when you listen to his daughter and the family, it's very passionate. Her line is right on the money, though.
She absolutely said it right. If you look at the Hall of Fame as telling the story of the game, you can't tell the story, the history of baseball, without mentioning Curt Flood. No question about that.
And again, that vote comes in December.